Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmiri. Thank you for joining today's conversation in this series of programs on the US-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. You can also listen to these programs as podcasts on your favorite platform. So this is your host, Sarwar Kashmiri, and my guest today is the well-known Malaysian economist, Doris Liew. Ms. Liew is an economist specializing in the economic development of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, regional and international trade dynamics, labor economics, poverty, inequality, and public finance. Welcome to Polaris-Live, Doris. So nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Sarah. Nice to be on the show.
Recent headlines in the Straits Times said it was President Trump that blinked in the trade war with China. Is this an accurate description of the image of the US president in Southeast Asia these days after his tariff flip-flops?
Yes, to a certain extent, I think that article is on point there. That blink by President Trump kind of shows a signal and appearance of slight weakness at the US side. And it seems that US is getting a bit more desperate to obtain deals with countries, particularly China. How that will move for ASEAN moving forward is that Southeast Asian countries are keenly observing the developments of these trade agreements and deals, and looking at that, even though China seems to emerge as a winner by retaliating rather than negotiating like what most countries did, there are two key things I want the audience to note. One, what is US resiliency against a global trade war? And it seems that US resiliencies can be faltering against big economies like China, like India. Second takeaway is, can ASEAN actually emulate China's bargaining power as a big economy? And that is something to consider whether we can adopt or not adopt China's strategy, despite how successful it seems to be at the moment.
So, Doris, I know most people know this, but ASEAN was set up by 10 Southeast Asian countries to have a grouping that would coordinate the trade, coordinate policies. Would you say, in view of what you've just mentioned, that the US tariffs have strengthened ASEAN's role for its member countries? Are the ASEAN countries holding together in the face of US tariffs, or are they splitting up, ready to strike out on their own?
I think there are two perspectives to look at these issues. One, countries are banding together in terms of forwarding an ASEAN-wide agenda and portraying that as a unified stance. At the same time, they are doing a dual strategy right now, right? On the one hand, looking at ASEAN as a whole. On the other hand, countries are ready to strike their own deal despite or the ASEAN meeting, despite a call by Malaysia as ASEAN chair for a consolidated response. And why is this happening? Why is ASEAN consensus, despite being, I think, the four or fifth biggest economies in the world, are not able to band together to present a united front? And that is because of the conflicting interests between the different ASEAN countries. And when we look at those 10 ASEAN countries, there are those that are very highly exposed to the US export markets, like Vietnam. And then you have those that are medium exposure, like Malaysia and Thailand and Indonesia. And you have those that are low exposure to merchandise goods exports with the US, and those are Singapore and Philippines. And when you look at how they approach the issue, they take a very different stance depending on their export dependency on the US. So Vietnam because of their high export exposure, they are more likely to offer more consensus to the US because anytime the US stop or put a high tariff on Vietnam goods, half of their economy are so reliant on export, it will wreck their GDP, it will wreck their economic developments. So Vietnam are very desperate to get a deal. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia has some alternative partners like China, like EU, and increasingly building up all these alternative partners, and therefore they have a little bit more leeways. They are still keen to develop a deal because any kind of fallout with the US markets is going to affect heavily on the domestic economy. But the impact on them is not as severe as Vietnam, so they still have some breathing space to kind of think about what to give in, and where is the areas that we can stand firm on during the negotiation. Philippines and Singapore, on the other hand, is like they are kind of comfortable right now, right? And they are approaching a little bit of a wait and see approach to see what U.S. response is after the 90 days tariff.
It's interesting what you've just said. So, are you also saying, Doris Liew, that ASEAN has fragmented a little bit because Vietnam seems to be an outlier, but it also is a member of ASEAN. And it's not an easy thing for all these disparate countries to coordinate their trade policies. And so would you say that there's some fragmentation taking place, some weakness? What's your thought?
It is ASEAN itself is quite fragmented, and I wouldn't say it is a weakness. It's just a different dynamic of the ASEAN countries because ASEAN is not like the EU. It doesn't have a single market. It doesn't have a commission to put the countries together. What ASEAN is 10 separate, diversified, very different culture, very different economy, very different development. It comes together by virtue of the geographical location and the proximity to each other. So for ASEAN itself, all the while, ASEAN has not been unified in economic, in social, in digital, in whatever front. They are trying to harmonize it via certain trade agreements. But a lot of the times, individual countries still have a lot of autonomy in terms of what they can pursue. So in this case, I would say the fragmentation is not a weakness, but is a characteristic of the ASEAN economies. And if you think about it, to negotiate with the US, each ASEAN economies has its own different tariff, non-tariff barriers, and different business environments. So to have a united front is also difficult to say what need to be changed and what consensus need to be made collectively. Individually, then the countries can then look into their own non-tariff barriers, and other trade barriers and business environments barriers that then they can make this tiny or small concession to the US depending on the unique situation of their economy.
Doris, this is off the script a little bit, but I can't but help reflect that this is this year, 2025, marks 50 years since the United States left Vietnam. And in that war, the United States dropped more bombs on tiny Vietnam than all of Europe in the Second World War. But isn't it interesting how times change and countries change, and America is now so close to Vietnam in trade, and it's the largest trading partner. Is there a Asian proverb that describes all this? I know that there is a Victorian proverb, right? That countries don't have permanent friends or permanent enemies, but only permanent interests. Does that describe where we are now with Vietnam and America?
I think yes, and Vietnam currently as like a export-oriented economies with a lot of a major part of its exports going to the United States, and I think these are a mutually beneficial relationship, right? Because the United States needs all these different kind of goods for consumptions, and for solar, for electricity and semiconductor appliances, and they can get it from countries like Vietnam, from Malaysia. Where else to produce it in US itself is, we know, inherently quite expensive. So having those countries exporting goods to them is also beneficial to the US. At the same time, I think for Vietnam, the US becomes increasingly like a very lucrative market to trade in. And actually in Asia, economy runs, like money talks, So as long as there is trade, there is money to be made, they will be keeping the relationship good and warm. Mm.
That's well said. So now you mentioned that Malaysia is the chair this year of ASEAN in the rotating chairmanship that ASEAN has. What would you say that the goals that Malaysia set for itself as chair as it entered this year, 2025, are the goals the same as they were when it began? Have they changed in view of the trading tariff situation? What's your thought?
There are certain vision that Malaysia wants to do that remains the same. So big examples are the upgrading of ATICA, which is ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, and then ASEAN GCC Gulf countries free trade agreements that are ongoing from the start of the chairmanship until now. And another part is the DEFA, Digital Economic Framework Agreements within ASEAN. And those negotiations are ongoing. And an update of ATICA is to finalize in the next 1 to 2 months. So we see that there are progress on these fronts in things that it wants to push for. In terms of the expanded role of Malaysian ASEAN chairmanship this year is, of course, the US tariff and the trade, and how ASEAN countries can maneuver the trade war together. So
Right.
just now I mentioned there are the individual countries' response to negotiation, but there's also a collective ASEAN response in terms of increasing intra-trade partnership and improving supply chain resiliencies, whether within ASEAN or with ASEAN and an external partner. So we see ASEAN and EU, ASEAN and India, ASEAN and China, and RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, has been built between these countries to actually increase supply chain interconnectivities between the countries, and that is one of the important pillars of ASEAN chairmanship this year.
But Doris, do you think that America, and especially America, has paid enough importance to ASEAN? We've had varying levels of attendance at ASEAN's annual meetings. What do you think? Have we paid enough attention, the U.S. to ASEAN, and what are your recommendations going forward?
I think more engagement by the US is imperative, because currently we see the Gulf countries and China playing increasingly dominant role in exerting their influence in the Southeast Asia countries. And even for the ASEAN Summit 2025 that's going to happen in Kuala Lumpur next week, we see that China and Gulf countries are invited and participating in those summits, but the representative from United States are relatively muted and absent. So the United States definitely needs to increase certain form of engagements with the ASEAN countries, both in terms of individual ASEAN countries and being present in such a regional and significant meetings and summit. So United States, as of currently, kind of lose out a little bit to China in terms of engaging with the Southeast Asian nation, and the tariff saga actually did not help instill trust among countries in this region that United States is a reliable partner. So United States needs to increase more of its foreign missions in this region. If it still cares a lot about this region and wants to remain engaged with the countries in this region, to put up more resources in here.
So Doris, let me take a moment to remind viewers that Polaris-Live is commercial free and entirely viewer supported. We'd appreciate viewers signing up to our mailing list at kashmiri.com and to our YouTube channel, www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost, and it really does help us. We always welcome your comments on our video and podcast channels. Doris, coming back to Malaysia earlier this year, Malaysia's economy minister, Rafizi Ramli, said that Chinese chip makers and technology companies are heading to Malaysia in droves to hedge against the US tariffs. Billions of dollars in investment, he said, will flow into Malaysia. In investment, he said, rivaling the US companies that have dominated the country's market. Has this flow begun? How are we grading this halfway through the year? Your thoughts?
They are pledged by Chinese companies, especially because of the Chinese Plus One policy by them, which has been ongoing for years, and now they're increasingly putting in more investment into ASEAN countries to bypass US tariff and trade barriers. So there are companies, for instance, ByteDance have pledged $2 billion of investments in data center in Malaysia. And depending on how we develop, we will see like either more or less investment from the Chinese company. Because while at the start of the year, there are increasing focus by Chinese company to have an alternative production base outside of China. It seems that right now, because of the reciprocal tariff and US crackdown on this alternative production based by China, particularly, I will give an example, is that the US have imposed heavy tariff on solar panel coming out from Malaysia and Vietnam because they suspect that the factories that produce solar panel in these countries are not from local Vietnamese or Malaysian companies, but they are Chinese companies that locate at those areas. So because of this incident, we see that it might be a little bit less attractive for Chinese companies right now to have an alternative production base. And therefore, we will see some kind of investment adjustments in the near future. There could still be some investment coming in because there are still certain benefits that the Chinese companies can get out of the ASEAN countries in terms of if it wants certain resources like labor, like land, and if it wants to increase supply chain connectivity between themselves and the ASEAN countries, then it's of interest of certain Chinese manufacturers and companies and investment firms to invest in the Southeast Asia region. An example is for Indonesia has a big nickel resources in the Papua area, and Chinese mining firms are huge. They have a big presence in Papua because of the nickel industry. So these are part of where Chinese companies can look at when investing. But this drove of Chinese investments going into the countries may actually be a bit more limited given the global environment currently.
Temporarily, you think?
Yeah.
Limited.
Yes.
Now listen, Doris, you used the phrase reciprocal tariff. The Economist newspaper called the imposition of reciprocal tariffs, quote, the most profound, harmful, and unnecessary economic error in the modern era. You agree with that?
Well,
what do you think?
So to a certain extent, to a certain extent, they are right that it is harmful and it is unnecessary, but not because tariff is necessarily a bad thing. Because tariff can also be used strategically to help domestic industries to grow. For instance, when China has a lot of goods, cheap Chinese goods that they export to developing countries like Indonesia, like Vietnam, and Thailand. These countries find that the cheap influx of goods are actually pushing out the domestic sectors. And a lot of the factories has to close down because of the imports. So in this case, having targeted tariff, temporary targeted tariff on on certain products, we call it anti-dumping tariff, will actually be useful to counter this temporary shift in supply chain and cheap goods. So I can see also like for Trump's reciprocal tariff, there is certain rationale behind it, which is to curb China's rise. But I think the implementation is really done very, very poorly because it is using a very absurd formula based on trade deficits to impose, to determine the tariff rates rather than US relationship with the country. So in that sense, even US allies get hit with the reciprocal tariff. And right now, a lot of the US allies are looking even for alternative markets and partners to diversify and de-risk from the US, who are very volatile currently.
It's fascinating. There was an editorial yesterday in the New York Times, right? It's probably not yet made circulation around the world, as it will. It basically said that this is the Chinese century. That if America keeps going the way it is now, it will at some point become irrelevant to the globe in the influence that it exerts. And it mentioned the tariffs as a skirmish in this war competition against China. Because China is putting all its efforts in developing EVs, artificial intelligence, increasing the teaching of scientific training. Schools in America is focusing on tariffs and simply cutting itself off. So even though this is a very new development, this editorial, it's soon going to, I believe, become very controversial. Give me your early thoughts on this, please, Doris.
Okay, so I think looking at it from the Chinese century, the author is right on a certain aspect that China is focusing a lot on manufacturing, on supply chain, and we've seen the results of it is that they are able to come up with large-scale, cheap manufacturings that the goods that are so competitive globally, that has become very desirable. And US, on the other hand, is going into the decline. And I would say that US decline started even before Trump's tariff comes in. It started for decades that US had manufacturing. Previously, in 1953, US has over 30% of its labor force in the manufacturing sector. And today, it's less than 10%. So the focus of US economy currently is more in services like finance and IT, and not so much on manufacturing. And that is where Chinese developments differs in terms that they focus and they realize the importance of controlling the supply chain, and therefore they invest in what we see today as the biggest factories in the world in China. So US, and I think that, in my perspective, Trump and Biden, to a certain extent, also recognized that there's an issue. And that's why during Biden's era, he did not claw back the policies imposed by the first Trump administration, but it doubled down on certain policies, like imposing chip restriction to the Chinese companies. And this has already been ongoing in the Biden era. But during Biden's time, it was still like very controlled, very subtle. I would say that Trump kind of pivot it through and tries to really make it explicit that they are fighting a global trade war with China. And that is what we see with the tariff, his attempt to do so. And I've mentioned just now, I kind of understand his rationale to curb China's rise, because right now, at the rate that it's going, if no intervention is made, China is going to get so far ahead of the US in terms of global power. So Trump's intervention, I see, is I can see why it's necessary, but then the way he does it is really pushing allies away and moving them a bit towards China. Southeast Asia right now is a little bit more friendly towards China currently. They have been receiving Xi Jinping, been welcoming Chinese investment and signing a lot of memorandum of understanding with Chinese firms. because of this. And there seems to be a little bit more distrust within the region of US because of how US doesn't really care about its allies that much.
Really interesting. This is something that we'll continue to explore at Polaris Live. So, but let me turn to a related topic, and that is, what are your views on possible U.S. ASEAN countries negotiating strategies? Because these temporary holds on the reciprocal tariffs will come to an end in 60 days or so, and countries are supposed to get together with the U.S. And strike deals, perhaps individually. Now, my specific question is that recently we got an example of how the American deal-making machinery works because of the US-UK deal that was signed, right? Do you think that there are any lessons for other countries from the UK-US deals? What kind of model do you see them following? Is there a uniform model, or each country will go out on its own? And ASEAN has a stake in it. Long question, but I'm going to give you some time to please answer it.
All right. So UK-US deal that does hold some lessons to it. And the biggest lesson is that the deal is not that substantial. What it means is that after the deal, we see that tariff on UK is still worse than the Trump's era, worse than before Trump's era. That is one. And two, we find that even though Trump has branded it as a historic deal, the terms of the deal itself are not really that historic in terms that UK did not make so much concession to the US. What it doesn't already have consensus in, and what it does is just giving US some small wins to kind of give Trump an ego boost, give Trump a win in terms of he can say that he get a deal done. He can say that he has a win in mind. Moving forward. So when ASEAN countries look at this, it can take as a lesson that what we should pursue is not a complete breakdown of our non-tariff barriers or other trade barriers, but a small consensus to the US. So Trump can have certain key messages to bring back to the American people, and then at the same time say that a deal is struck and give us a good deal, like a good tariff, because it's also in the US interest to strike the deal. Currently, as we know, the inflation is going up because all the goods going to US are getting tariff heavily, and the American consumers are the ones getting the brunt of this economic inflation. So having some deals and at the same time lowering some tariff will offer some relief for the US economy. That's how I see it.
So as we run into the end of this session, Doris, Polaris Live has made one assumption when we started, which is that the US-China relationship is the most consequential of our time, not just for the two countries involved, but for its impact on all other countries in the world. If you got some private time alone with President Trump and with President Xi Jinping, what might be one or two thoughts you would leave with them to cool the temperatures?
All right, that is very spicy. So for the US, I would tell President Trump to probably consider allies more closely and implement probably a tiered treatment for allies and non-allies. And this will not only build trust within the allies region, but for non-allies and neutral countries, it will also help to push them more towards the US side. For China, I think it's generally be more supportive of international trade norms because as we know historically, they have been breaking some WTO rules in the past to gain trade preferential treatments and gains in the global supply chain. So right now, because it's a global power, it should be more open to being a leaders in following the international trade rules. and be more open to integrate its supply chain with other countries instead of monopolizing manufacturing, because this can actually build more trust with other nations.
Well, Doris Liew, I wish we could keep going on. This is so educational, but we have, alas, run out of time. So thank you so very much for that thought-provoking perspective from a very vibrant Asian economy. I do hope you'll come back and see us again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you also to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship of our time, United States and China, and its impact on the world. Until next time then, goodbye.